On April 14, 2023, at 10:22 in the morning, Griffin Hayes, 39 years old, master technical diver with 17 years of deep-water experience and former Navy clearance diver, descended past 1,000 feet below the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, 68 miles southeast of Crete, when his helmet-mounted sonar detected something that violated every principle of marine archaeology he'd spent 2 decades learning. At 1,140 feet depth, well beyond the limits where nitrogen narcosis turns most divers into confused children, the reading showed a geometric structure spanning 420 feet across the seafloor, with walls forming perfect hexagonal corridors and what appeared to be systematic markings along every surface. Griffin was using a closed-circuit rebreather with Trimix 1050, 10% oxygen, 50% helium, 40% nitrogen, specifically calibrated for extreme depth work. His dive partner, Reese Calhoun, monitored from the support vessel above, tracking vitals and communication through a fiber optic tether that allowed real-time video feed and telemetry data. The conditions were unusual for the eastern Mediterranean in April. Visibility extended past 100 feet, currents measured below 0.3 knots, and water temperature held steady at 43 degrees Fahrenheit with almost no thermocline variation. Reese would later describe the conditions as textbook perfect, which never happens at that depth, which should have been our first warning. Griffin Hayes wasn't supposed to be there looking for impossibilities. He was supposed to be mapping catalogued Phoenician ruins for a private archaeological survey, a straightforward technical dive to document known sites before commercial shipping expansion threatened the area. The contract had come through a referral from a colleague at Woods Hole, clean paperwork, proper permits from the Hellenic Ministry of Culture, and a generous day rate that covered the cost of helium and the risk premium for anything past 1,000 feet. The client, listed as Dr. Audrey Vance from the Maritime Archaeology Institute in Boston had been cordial but distant during their satellite phone briefings, providing precise GPS coordinates and explaining that previous sonar surveys suggested well-preserved stonework worthy of detailed photogrammetry. Griffin had worked Alexandria's submerged harbor complex, he'd documented Roman shipwrecks off Sicily, and he'd spent 3 years as a Navy diver before his twin daughters were born, and he'd transitioned to private sector work where he could control his own schedule and actually see his kids grow up. He knew ancient Mediterranean construction. He knew what Phoenician stonework looked like underwater after 3,000 years of current and biological growth. This wasn't that. Griffin's helmet camera captured what happened at depth with clinical precision. At 1,140 feet, where the partial pressure of nitrogen should induce euphoria, confusion, and severely impaired judgment, a condition divers call rapture of the deep. Griffin's audio commentary was sharp, technical, and unnervingly focused. He described architectural measurements to the millimeter. He identified geometric patterns in the wall markings using terms from advanced mathematics. And then, at timestamp 10:37 a.m., his gloved hand appeared in frame holding a dive slate, and he began sketching symbols he was seeing on the structure's surface, reproducing complex glyphs with steady precision, while narrating their potential astronomical significance. At 1,140 feet depth, this level of cognitive function wasn't just unusual. It was medically impossible. Nitrogen narcosis at that depth is comparable to a blood alcohol content of 0.20. Divers forget their names. They offer their regulators to passing fish. They try to swim deeper instead of ascending. They don't perform mathematical analysis of ancient writing systems while maintaining perfect buoyancy control. The structure itself presented problems that would take Griffin hours to process once he returned to the surface and his brain chemistry normalized. The walls showed tolerances of 0.2 millimeters across spans of 15 feet. Precision that predated modern machining by thousands of years, according to the archaeological dating of the area. The corridors were exactly 12 feet in height, not varying by more than half an inch across the 420 feet of passage his sonar had mapped. And the symbols, Griffin had studied comparative ancient languages as part of his archaeology minor at Boston University 20 years ago, enough to recognize Egyptian hieroglyphics, Phoenician script, Linear A and Linear B from Minoan Crete. These markings were none of those. They were something else entirely, something that combined pictographic elements with what appeared to be mathematical notation and star charts, all carved with such precision that his helmet lights caught no tool marks, no chisel strikes, nothing but smooth incisions in stone that shouldn't exist in the pre-Bronze Age Mediterranean. Griffin collected samples according to protocol, using a small diamond-tipped core drill to extract 3 fragments from separate corridor walls. He photographed every surface his lights could reach, shot video with 2 different cameras as backup, and filled 4 pages of his dive slate with sketches and notations. His bottom time reached 23 minutes before he initiated his ascent protocol. At 1,140 feet, using trimix, he needed 4 hours and 15 minutes of decompression stops to safely return to the surface. Reese Calhoun guided him through the staged ascent, monitoring for any signs of decompression sickness, oxygen toxicity, or the delayed cognitive effects of nitrogen narcosis. Griffin's vitals remained stable. His communication remained clear. And at each decompression stop, as he hung in blue water waiting for dissolved gases to safely leave his bloodstream, he kept reviewing his dive slate, kept studying the symbols he'd sketched, and kept experiencing something he couldn't quite explain to Reese through the communication system. The growing certainty that he understood what the symbols meant, not through translation or academic analysis, but through direct comprehension, as if he'd always known how to read them and had simply forgotten until now. During the decompression stop at 90 feet, suspended in crystalline blue water with nothing but his thoughts, and the slow passage of time required to prevent dissolved nitrogen from forming fatal bubbles in his bloodstream, Griffin Hayes kept returning to the moment he'd found the entrance. It hadn't been a doorway in any conventional sense, no lintel or threshold worn by millennia of current. Instead, at the western terminus of the hexagonal corridor system, his lights had illuminated a perfectly circular opening, exactly 15 feet in diameter, edges so precise they could have been cut with a laser, leading into darkness that his helmet-mounted floods couldn't fully penetrate. The opening had no door, no barrier, nothing to suggest it had ever been sealed or protected. Just an invitation into depths of the structure his sonar couldn't map, because the walls were too dense, composed of stone that returned echoes suggesting impossible uniformity and mass. Reese had asked him 3 times if he was certain about entering an unmapped interior space at 1,140 feet depth, because technical diving protocol demanded conservatism, demanded that you never exceeded your planned exposure, never pushed into unknown environments without support, divers, and redundant systems. Griffin had hesitated, had checked his remaining bottom time, had calculated the gas supply in his rebreather's onboard computer, and then he'd made the decision that would change everything. He'd entered the structure, moving slowly through the circular portal into a chamber that shouldn't exist. The interior space had been massive, far larger than the external dimensions of the structure suggested, as if the corridors he'd been following were merely the outer shell of something that extended deeper into the seafloor or perhaps laterally in directions his sonar hadn't detected. His lights revealed walls that curved upward into a dome approximately 60 feet in diameter and 30 feet high, every surface covered in the same precise symbols and mathematical notations he'd seen outside. But here they were arranged in columns and rows that suggested systematic organization, almost like the stacks of a library or the ordered shelving of an archive. But there were no shelves, no pedestals, no stone tablets resting on surfaces. Instead, suspended in the water column at various heights throughout the chamber, Griffin had seen metallic plates, each roughly 3 feet by 2 feet in dimension, hanging motionless in the current as if held by invisible supports. He'd approached the nearest one cautiously, his hand reaching out to touch what appeared to be a bronze or copper alloy surface. And the moment his gloved fingertips made contact, the plate had rotated smoothly in place, revealing different symbols on its reverse side, moving with frictionless precision that suggested bearings or magnetic suspension, technology that had no business existing in a structure that predated recorded Mediterranean civilization. Griffin's dive computer, mounted on his left wrist and constantly monitoring depth, time, gas mixture, and environmental conditions, had begun showing readings that made him question whether the nitrogen narcosis was affecting him after all, despite his subjective clarity. The water temperature, which had held steady at 43 degrees Fahrenheit throughout his descent and approach to the structure, now read 68 degrees in the interior chamber. Not gradually warming, not showing thermocline variation, but displaying a stable 68 degrees, as if the chamber somehow maintained its own climate, independent of the surrounding Mediterranean. The pressure reading remained accurate at 1,140 feet, which meant he was experiencing 50 atmospheres of pressure, but water at 68 degrees Fahrenheit shouldn't remain liquid at that depth without some form of pressurization system or physical container preventing it from reaching thermal equilibrium with the surrounding ocean. Griffin had documented enough underwater sites to know that temperature variations existed in marine environments. Geothermal vents and volcanic activity created localized heat sources, but those phenomena were accompanied by visible water movement, by shimmering distortion, by measurable current patterns. This chamber showed none of that. The water was perfectly still, perfectly clear, and impossibly warm. The symbols on the suspended plates weren't pictographic representations or alphabetic characters in any language Griffin recognized from his academic training. They were mathematical equations, geometric diagrams, and what appeared to be astronomical charts showing star positions and planetary orbits, all rendered in a notation system that combined familiar elements like circles and lines and angles with operators and relationships he'd never encountered in any textbook. And yet, as he'd moved through the chamber, documenting plate after plate with his helmet camera, Griffin had found himself reading them, not decoding them through analysis or comparison, but directly comprehending their meaning as if they were written in English or any other language he spoke fluently. One plate showed equations describing gravitational relationships between celestial bodies. Another displayed orbital mechanics for a solar system that wasn't ours, with 7 planets in stable resonance patterns around a single star. A third contained what he could only describe as a timeline, a historical record marked not in years or dynasties, but in astronomical cycles, precession of equinoxes spanning thousands of years, with notations indicating specific events or observations at intervals that predated the oldest human civilizations by factors that made his academic training rebel against accepting what his mind insisted he was reading correctly. His helmet camera had begun malfunctioning at timestamp 10:41 a.m., 17 minutes into his exploration of the chamber. The video feed recorded by Reese's equipment on the surface showed the footage playing in reverse, images of Griffin moving backward through the chamber, even though the audio track continued forward in real time with his normal commentary and breathing sounds. Reese had immediately asked him to check the camera system, thinking perhaps the fiber optic transmission was damaged or experiencing interference. But Griffin's onboard recording system showed the same impossible playback, video running backward while audio maintained correct temporal direction. A technical failure that shouldn't occur because video and audio were encoded in the same data stream, processed by the same hardware, governed by the same timing circuits. He'd cycled the camera off and back on, checked connections, verified power supply, and the malfunction had persisted, as if the laws governing electronic systems had become negotiable within the chamber's confines. Griffin had continued documenting using still photography and his dive slate, but the wrongness of the camera behavior had planted the first seed of genuine fear in his mind, because equipment failures at 1,140 feet depth could kill you, and failures that violated basic causality suggested something far worse than simple mechanical breakdown. The moment that would haunt Griffin's thoughts during every subsequent decompression stop, during the long, slow ascent back to sunlight and surface pressure, came when he'd photographed a specific plate near the chamber's center, one that displayed what appeared to be a map of the Mediterranean basin, as it might have looked 12,000 years ago, before the end of the last ice age, before rising sea levels had flooded coastlines and transformed the geography of human civilization. The symbols marking specific locations around the ancient shoreline were familiar now. He could read them as easily as street signs in his hometown, and they indicated other structures, other sites, coordinates for what appeared to be a network of installations spanning from the Strait of Gibraltar to the coast of what would become Israel, 14 locations total, arranged in geometric precision that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural distribution. And beneath the map, in notation, he understood despite having no rational explanation for that understanding, was a date marker, a timestamp in the astronomical calendar system the plates used consistently. Archive initialization, cycle marker 315, after convergence event. Griffin didn't know what convergence event meant. He didn't know what civilization or intelligence had created this archive or these suspended libraries of impossible knowledge. But he knew, with certainty, that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to some newly activated comprehension in his mind that cycle marker 315 translated roughly to 12,700 years before his present moment, which meant this structure had been operational since the end of the Younger Dryas, since the mysterious global cataclysm that had ended the Ice Age and reshaped human history. He'd collected his final samples, photographed the last accessible plates, and checked his remaining bottom time before beginning his exit from the chamber, moving back through the 15-foot circular portal into the hexagonal corridors beyond. And as he'd cleared the threshold, his dive computer had immediately returned to normal readings, 43 degrees Fahrenheit, no temperature anomaly, no impossible thermal stability, as if the chamber's interior existed in a different physical space, governed by different rules. His camera had resumed normal function the moment he left the structure's interior. The malfunction had ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the corrupted video files as evidence that anything unusual had occurred at all. Griffin had begun his ascent, following the fiber optic tether back up through blue water toward the distant surface, toward 4 hours and 15 minutes of decompression stops, where he would have nothing to do but think about what he'd found, and what it meant, and why his mind could suddenly read a notation system that had no business being comprehensible to a 21st-century human diver from Massachusetts who'd grown up playing Little League and watching Red Sox games, and certainly hadn't spent his childhood learning the mathematical language of a civilization that predated Sumeria by 8,000 years. The decompression stops became an exercise in maintaining sanity, while Griffin's mind insisted on showing him knowledge he'd never learned and couldn't possibly possess. At the 60-foot stop, hanging motionless for 38 minutes while his body processed dissolved gases, he found himself mentally reviewing equations describing quantum entanglement and non-local correlation effects, concepts he vaguely remembered from a single undergraduate physics course 2 decades ago, but certainly hadn't retained in detail, and yet now the mathematics flowed through his thoughts with crystalline precision, variables and operators arranging themselves into elegant proofs he could visualize as clearly as his own dive slate sketches. At the 30-foot stop, required time 47 minutes, his mind wandered through what he recognized as linguistic structures, grammar and syntax for languages he'd never studied, Proto-Indo-European root words that academic linguists spent careers reconstructing from fragmentary evidence. But in Griffin's thoughts, they appeared complete, fully formed, with pronunciation and semantic nuance that felt less like memory and more like skills he'd always possessed, but never accessed until something in that chamber had opened a door in his consciousness that wasn't supposed to exist. Reese kept asking if he was okay, if he was experiencing any symptoms of decompression sickness or oxygen toxicity, and Griffin kept responding that he felt fine, that his mental state was clear, which was technically true even though the definition of clear had fundamentally changed during the 97 minutes he'd spent inside a structure that shouldn't be possible. He surfaced at 3:51 in the afternoon, breaking through into Mediterranean sunlight and fresh air after 4 hours and 15 minutes of staged ascent. And the first thing Griffin saw when he cleared his mask was a Hellenic Navy patrol vessel positioned exactly 200 yards from their dive boat. Gray hull and deck-mounted equipment and radio antennas suggesting military communication capabilities far beyond routine coastal patrol. Reese helped him aboard their chartered vessel, removed his rebreather harness, and began the standard post-dive procedures of checking equipment and logging times and depths. But both of them were watching the Navy ship, watching the rigid inflatable boat being lowered from its davits, with 6 personnel aboard, including 2 in officer uniforms. The patrol vessel had arrived from Suda Bay Naval Base on Crete, a journey that normally required 3 to 4 hours depending on sea conditions, but Griffin had been underwater for a total of 4 hours and 38 minutes counting his bottom time, which meant the Navy ship would have needed to depart Suda Bay, while Griffin was still at depth, before he'd radioed any discovery, before he'd surfaced to report what he'd found. Reese pointed this out quietly, checking his watch and doing the mental calculation, and the question neither of them voiced, but both were thinking, was simple and terrifying. How did the Hellenic Navy know to respond before Griffin had told anyone what he'd discovered? The boarding party was professional and courteous, led by a Greek naval officer who introduced himself as Commander Phelps, speaking English with a slight accent that placed his education somewhere in the United States, possibly Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. He explained that the area had been designated as archaeologically sensitive under UNESCO Maritime Heritage Protection Protocols, that any discoveries required immediate documentation and preservation procedures, and that Griffin's equipment and collected samples would need to be transferred to proper archaeological custody to prevent contamination or damage. The explanation was reasonable on its surface, the kind of bureaucratic procedure Griffin had encountered before when working Mediterranean sites, except for 3 problems that his newly enhanced mental clarity immediately identified. First, UNESCO protocols didn't authorize military seizure of private equipment. They required civil archaeological authorities and proper chain of custody. Second, Commander Phelps already knew Griffin had collected samples and documented the site in detail. information that should have required reviewing dive logs and debriefing the diver, not something knowable before boarding the vessel. Third, the paperwork Phelps presented for signature had been prepared in advance, dated that morning with Griffin's name and passport number already filled in, suggesting someone had known exactly who would be diving this location and what would need to be confiscated before Griffin had even descended past 1,000 feet. They took everything: the rebreather with its onboard computers and dive logs, both helmet cameras, and all memory cards. The waterproof case containing his backup storage drives. The 3 core samples from the structure's walls, each carefully labeled and sealed. His dive slate with its sketches of the symbols. His personal dive computer from his wrist. Even his smartphone, which Commander Phelps politely explained needed to be checked for any photographs Griffin might have taken of equipment displays or post-dive documentation. Griffin had expected this, had anticipated the possibility of confiscation the moment he'd seen the Navy vessel, which was why, during his final decompression stop, he'd used the underwater slate to carefully redraw a dozen of the most significant symbols from memory, then photographed those sketches with a small waterproof camera he'd kept in a pocket of his dry suit. A camera the boarding party never found because Griffin had palmed it into Reese's hand during their post-dive equipment removal, while the Navy personnel were still crossing in their inflatable boat. The samples and video were gone, but Griffin had preserved fragments of evidence, not enough to prove anything conclusively, but enough to begin asking the right questions. The official explanation came 3 hours later via satellite phone, a call to Reese's vessel from someone identifying herself as Dr. Audrey Vance, the same archaeological contractor who'd hired Griffin for the survey dive. Her voice was warm and apologetic, explaining that the site had turned out to be more significant than preliminary sonar suggested, that the Hellenic government had invoked emergency heritage protection, and that Griffin's excellent documentation would be processed through proper channels with full credit for the discovery. She thanked him for his professionalism, promised that his contracted payment would be processed immediately, and assured him that the temporary equipment confiscation was purely procedural, and everything would be returned within 2 weeks after archaeological assessment. The conversation lasted 6 minutes and contained 0 specific details about what Griffin had actually found, no questions about the structure's dimensions or the symbols or the impossible temperature readings, just smooth professional courtesy that said everything necessary while revealing nothing true. Griffin waited until she disconnected, then asked Reese to check the satellite phone's caller ID log, which showed a number with a Massachusetts area code matching the Maritime Archaeology Institute Dr. Vance claimed to represent. Griffin called the number back immediately. It rang 4 times and connected to a generic voicemail system with no institutional identification. He left no message. The investigation Griffin conducted over the following 72 hours, working from a hotel room in Heraklion, while Reese handled the logistics of returning their chartered vessel to its owner, revealed facts that transformed confusion into active fear. Dr. Audrey Vance didn't exist, not as a faculty member at any maritime archaeology program in Massachusetts, not as a published researcher in any academic database Griffin could access, not as a registered professional with any archaeological certification body. The institute she'd claimed to represent was real, but when Griffin called their main office and asked to speak with Dr. Vance, the receptionist politely informed him they had no one by that name on staff and no current projects in the Eastern Mediterranean. The satellite phone number that had been calling Griffin for 2 months during planning phases traced to a telecommunications contractor that primarily served United States Defense Department clients. The bank account that had transferred Griffin's $50,000 deposit payment was registered to a Delaware limited liability company with no public ownership records and no online presence beyond its legal registration. Someone with significant resources and careful operational security had hired Griffin to find that structure, had provided precise coordinates, had known exactly when he would dive, and had arranged military response before he'd surfaced with evidence of what he'd discovered. But the pattern that truly frightened Griffin emerged when he started searching for similar incidents, using terms like Mediterranean archaeology, military confiscation, and unusual underwater structures in various combinations across diving forums and archaeological mailing lists and news databases going back 15 years. He found 4 cases. In 2011, a French technical diver named Marcel Laurent had reported finding geometric formations inconsistent with known ancient architecture near Malta, had his equipment confiscated by NATO naval personnel, and subsequently stopped posting in diving communities. In 2015, an Israeli archaeologist named Rachel Cohen had published preliminary findings about anomalous construction techniques at a site off Cyprus, then retracted the paper 3 weeks later, citing measurement errors, despite peer reviewers having approved the original submission. In 2018, a Turkish commercial diving company had reported sonar contacts suggesting artificial structures of unknown origin in the Aegean Sea, had their survey contract terminated, and faced legal action for violating unspecified maritime regulations. In 2022, a Greek research team had announced discovery of advanced engineering predating known Mediterranean civilizations near the coast of Libya, then went silent, with their university subsequently stating the findings were pending further analysis, with no updates published since. 4 incidents across 4 different countries, 4 different discovery contexts, all involving structures in the Mediterranean that challenged archaeological understanding, all resulting in immediate institutional suppression and professional consequences for the discoverers. Griffin's technical diving certifications were suspended 5 days after his surface, with notification from the Professional Association of Diving Instructors that his credentials required routine safety review before reinstatement, a procedure Griffin had never heard of in 17 years of technical diving. His family, his wife Claire, and his twin daughters, who'd just turned 11, received a visit from 2 men in suits who identified themselves as cultural attachés from the Greek consulate in Boston, and asked if Griffin had brought home any artifacts or archaeological materials from his recent Mediterranean diving work, a question that would have been routine, except Greek cultural attachés don't typically make house calls to suburban Massachusetts for routine inquiries. Claire called Griffin immediately, described the visit, mentioned that one of the men had asked specifically about Griffin's mental state after experiencing significant narcosis at depth, information that shouldn't have been accessible to Greek diplomatic personnel but was documented in Griffin's confiscated dive computer logs. The message was clear without being explicit. Someone was watching. Someone knew details of Griffin's dive that should have been private, and someone wanted him to understand that continuing to investigate or discuss his discovery would have consequences extending beyond his professional credentials. The invitation arrived 1 week after his return to the United States, delivered by courier to Griffin's home address, printed on heavy paper stock with embossed letterhead from the Office of Naval Research. The letter invited Griffin to participate in a voluntary technical consultation regarding his recent diving experience in the Eastern Mediterranean, scheduled at a naval facility in Newport, Rhode Island, with travel expenses covered and consultation fees offered at standard government contractor rates. The letter was signed by a rear admiral whose name Griffin didn't recognize, included a security clearance application form, and politely requested his attendance within 30 days. The word voluntary appeared 3 times in 2 paragraphs. Griffin read the letter twice, showed it to Claire, who immediately asked if he was going to accept, and he told her honestly that he didn't know. because the invitation wasn't really voluntary when his certifications were suspended and his family was receiving visits from people who shouldn't know his dive details. But attending meant stepping further into whatever institutional machinery had been monitoring that structure for decades. And once you entered that world voluntarily, extraction became much more complicated. He put the letter on his desk and left it unanswered while he decided whether the truth about what he'd found was worth the cost of pursuing it. Griffin's decision about the naval research invitation became irrelevant 18 days after his return from Crete, when he received an encrypted email to an address he used exclusively for technical diving contracts, a contact method that fewer than 20 people in the world possessed. The sender identified himself only as a former colleague of the people currently interested in your Mediterranean findings, and proposed a meeting at a public location in Cambridge, near MIT's campus, where Griffin could bring whoever he wanted for security and leave at any moment if the conversation seemed dangerous or unproductive. The email included 3 pieces of information that proved the sender's credibility. First, the exact GPS coordinates of Griffin's dive site to 6 decimal places, coordinates that had been confiscated with his equipment. Second, a photograph of one of the metallic plates from the chamber's interior, showing symbols Griffin recognized from his own sketches, a photograph that could only have come from classified documentation of the site. Third, a name Griffin had found during his research into similar incidents: Marcel Laurent, the French diver who'd gone silent after his 2011 discovery near Malta, along with a Boston phone number and the note, "He's willing to talk now if you are." Griffin called the number. Marcel answered on the second ring, speaking English with a thick accent, and confirmed he'd be at the Cambridge meeting, that he trusted the person who'd arranged it, and that Griffin needed to understand what he'd actually found before making any decisions about cooperating with military or government authorities who'd been studying these structures for decades while telling the public absolutely nothing. The meeting took place in a coffee shop on Massachusetts Avenue, 3 blocks from the MIT campus where Griffin had earned his undergraduate degree in the 1990s, and the man who'd arranged it introduced himself as Holden Rask, 56 years old, formerly with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, working on deep ocean sensor systems and autonomous underwater vehicles, now an independent consultant who occasionally shared information with journalists and researchers he felt deserved to understand what their government was concealing. Marcel Laurent was there, looking older than his 48 years, speaking quietly about his own discovery 13 years earlier, about the same hexagonal corridors and suspended metallic plates and impossible temperature readings, about developing the same unexplainable comprehension of mathematical concepts he'd never studied. Holden listened to both their accounts, took notes on a paper pad rather than any electronic device, and then explained what he'd learned during 16 years working on classified programs before his security clearance had been revoked for asking too many uncomfortable questions about the Mediterranean structure's true nature and the extent of institutional knowledge regarding their existence and purpose. The structures weren't ancient repositories of lost knowledge, Holden explained, weren't libraries left behind by some pre-Diluvian civilization that had achieved technological sophistication and then vanished from history. They were active systems, operational archives that had been continuously recording and storing information for at least 12,000 years and possibly much longer, automated installations that monitored human activity and development with the same systematic precision that modern satellites tracked weather patterns or scientific instruments measured seismic activity. The metallic plates that Griffin and Marcel had seen weren't historical records carved by ancient hands. They were data storage media being continuously updated through processes that remained poorly understood even by the research teams that had been studying the structures since their initial discovery in the early 1970s, by NATO deep submergence vehicles conducting classified seafloor mapping operations. Holden produced a document from his messenger bag, 20 pages of photocopied material with classification markings redacted, but enough context remaining to verify its authenticity. A 1973 technical report from a joint American-Greek naval research program describing anomalous artificial structures displaying active information processing capabilities inconsistent with archaeological timelines or known terrestrial technology. The report's conclusions, buried in technical language and cautious phrasing, essentially stated that whoever or whatever had built these installations was still operating them, still maintaining them, still using them for purposes that posed potential national security implications requiring ongoing monitoring and analysis. Seat. Griffin's fragment, the microscopic sample he'd kept hidden from the confiscation, the piece he'd given to a private laboratory for analysis using money from his own savings account and a fake name to prevent tracing, had revealed evidence that fundamentally changed the nature of what he'd discovered. The metallurgical composition showed alloy percentages that matched no known fabrication process, 99.97% purity, in a bronze-like mixture that should contain far more impurities if produced through any historical or modern smelting technique. The crystalline structure at the microscopic level displayed organization that suggested molecular-scale engineering, precision assembly of metal atoms in patterns that materials scientists described as theoretically possible, but practically unachievable with current or near-future human technology. But the finding that kept Griffin awake at night came from isotope analysis, specifically the ratios of various metal isotopes that allowed dating through radioactive decay processes. The fragment contained isotopic signatures inconsistent with terrestrial origin, ratios of copper and tin isotopes that didn't match the natural abundances found anywhere in Earth's crust, suggesting either extraterrestrial source material or manufacturing processes that could manipulate nuclear structure in ways that violated understanding of chemistry and physics. And when the laboratory had used electron microscopy to examine the surface inscriptions at nanometer resolution, they'd found something that shouldn't exist. The symbols continued down to molecular scales, information encoded at sizes far below what human eyes could perceive, data density that exceeded modern computer storage by factors of thousands, all containing what appeared to be systematic records of events, dates calculated not in historical calendars but in astronomical cycles, including notations that, when Griffin translated them using his acquired comprehension, described occurrences from the years 2019 through 2023, events from his own lifetime recorded in a notation system that predated human writing. The pattern of structures across the Mediterranean formed geometric precision that demolished any possibility of random distribution or independent construction. 14 confirmed locations arranged in a network that connected Gibraltar to the Levantine coast, each site positioned at coordinates that created perfect equilateral triangles and hexagonal relationships when mapped on a sphere, accounting for Earth's curvature and rotation. Holden showed them maps, both historical NATO surveys and more recent satellite-derived bathymetry, highlighting each known location with dates of discovery ranging from 1973 to Griffin's own 2023 dive. And the geometric relationships were undeniable. Mathematical proof that someone had planned this network with understanding of planetary geodesy and precision positioning that suggested either advanced ancient surveying capabilities or, more disturbingly, construction by intelligences that understood Earth's geometry from orbital or external perspective. The structures weren't hidden, Holden emphasized. They were simply deep enough and remote enough that discovering them required specific technical capabilities and motivations. But once you knew where to look, once you had the coordinates and the resources to reach 1,000 feet or deeper, they were there, waiting, recording, processing information through means that decades of classified research had failed to fully explain or replicate. Marcel described his own experience after exposure to the structure near Malta, the same development of linguistic and mathematical comprehension that Griffin was experiencing, abilities that persisted years after the dive, that allowed Marcel to learn new languages with unsettling ease and to understand technical concepts in physics and engineering despite having no formal training in those fields. Two other divers Holden had located, one Israeli and one Turkish, reported identical effects: enhanced pattern recognition, improved mathematical reasoning, and most disturbing, occasional experiences of knowing information they couldn't have learned through any normal means, as if the structure's exposure had created some form of persistent connection between the divers' minds and the archive systems, allowing information to flow in directions that shouldn't be possible. Griffin admitted he'd been experiencing similar phenomena, waking from dreams with solutions to technical problems he'd been considering, understanding research papers in fields outside his expertise, and most recently, finding himself drawing symbols from the archive in margins of notebooks without consciously deciding to do so. Automatic behavior suggesting his brain had internalized the notation system at levels below conscious awareness. The question that Holden couldn't answer, the central mystery that classified research programs had pursued for 50 years without resolution, was deceptively simple. Who built these archives, and for what ultimate purpose? The structures clearly monitored human activity and recorded human history with systematic precision, but they predated human civilization by thousands of years, suggesting they'd been positioned and activated long before there was anything worth monitoring. Were they designed to track humanity specifically, implying their creators knew in advance that this planet would develop intelligent technological life? Were they general-purpose recording systems deployed across multiple worlds, gathering data on any civilizations that might emerge? And, most unsettling, what happened to the accumulated data? Where did it go? And who or what would eventually come to retrieve or review 12,000 years of recorded human development? Holden had found references in leaked documents to transmission events, periodic bursts of extremely low-frequency electromagnetic radiation detected emanating from the structures and propagating through Earth's crust and oceans, signals that seemed to carry encoded information but terminated at the ocean surface without obvious destination or receiver, as if the structures were broadcasting to something that no longer existed or hadn't yet arrived. Griffin asked the obvious question: if these installations had been recording humanity for 12,000 years, accumulating data on every aspect of human civilization and development, what would they have recorded about humanity's technological progress, its wars and discoveries, its potential as a species? And when their operators eventually returned to review the archives, what conclusions would they reach about whether humanity represented a civilization worth contacting, preserving, or perhaps quarantining to prevent its expansion beyond Earth? Griffin Hayes lost 3 commercial diving contracts in the 6 weeks following his meeting with Holden Rask and Marcel Laurent, clients who'd worked with him for years, suddenly citing scheduling conflicts or budget reallocation, with apologies that felt scripted and uncomfortable. And he understood without being told explicitly that word had circulated through maritime industry channels that Griffin had become a liability, someone whose involvement might attract unwanted attention from authorities or complicate insurance underwriting or simply raise questions that clients preferred to avoid. But he also received offers, anonymous consulting work that arrived through encrypted channels and intermediary contacts, projects that paid significantly above market rates and never asked for public acknowledgement or official documentation, assignments that involved reviewing technical specifications for deep ocean sensor systems, or analyzing bathymetric data from specific Mediterranean locations, or translating unusual mathematical notation found in historical texts that somehow always seemed connected to the same underlying questions about what existed beneath the seafloor and who might be monitoring humanity's progress. Griffin accepted some of these contracts, enough to maintain his family's financial stability, while his official diving credentials remained suspended, and he didn't ask too many questions about who ultimately funded the work or what they intended to do with his analyses, because the money came with an implicit understanding. He could continue investigating privately as long as he never discussed his findings publicly, never sought media attention, never tried to force institutional disclosure of what had been kept classified for 5 decades. The exclusion zone around his dive site expanded to 12 nautical miles in May of 2023, just 6 weeks after Griffin's discovery, with Greek maritime authorities issuing navigation warnings that cited ongoing archaeological research operations and prohibited all vessel traffic within the designated area under penalty of significant fines and possible criminal charges for interference with heritage preservation. Commercial satellite imagery, the kind available to anyone with internet access and modest subscription fees, showed research vessels maintaining continuous presence at the coordinates Griffin had documented. Ships equipped with cranes and submersible deployment systems and satellite communication arrays, suggesting operations far more sophisticated than routine archaeological survey. Griffin tracked the vessels through publicly available maritime tracking systems, noting that they rotated in patterns suggesting 24-hour operations, that their registered owners traced to defense contractors and government research institutions rather than academic archaeological programs, and that several ships displayed no identification markings visible in satellite photos, suggesting military or intelligence community involvement that preferred to avoid public scrutiny. The official narrative emerging in academic journals and occasional news coverage described the site as containing unusually well-preserved examples of Bronze Age Mediterranean maritime infrastructure, language that was technically accurate while revealing absolutely nothing about hexagonal corridors or suspended data plates or temperature anomalies that violated thermodynamics. 3 of the 4 previous divers that Holden had identified, the individuals who'd encountered similar structures between 2011 and 2022, agreed to speak with Griffin through secure communication channels after Holden facilitated introductions and assured them Griffin wasn't working with authorities or seeking to expose their identities publicly. Their accounts matched Griffin's experience with disturbing consistency. Marcel Laurent from the Malta discovery, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been part of the Israeli archaeological team that found the Cyprus structure, and a Turkish commercial diver named Kemal Ozturk, who'd surveyed the Aegean site. All 3 reported the same cognitive enhancements Griffin was experiencing, the sudden comprehension of mathematical concepts and linguistic patterns they'd never formally studied, abilities that had persisted and even strengthened in the years since their exposures to the archive structures. But they also described phenomena that Griffin had only recently begun noticing in his own experience. Vivid dreams containing technical information about physics and astronomy, waking moments where they knew facts about historical events or scientific principles without being able to identify how or when they'd learned them, and most unsettling, a persistent sensation that something was accessing their memories while they slept, reviewing their experiences and knowledge through a connection they couldn't explain or sever, as if exposure to the archives had created permanent neural pathways that allowed information to flow in both directions regardless of physical distance from the structures themselves. The physical evidence Griffin had managed to preserve consisted of fragments that individually proved little but collectively suggested patterns worth investigating further. He'd kept the low-resolution photographs from his personal phone, images he'd quickly captured of his dive computer displays and equipment settings before the official confiscation. Photos that showed the temperature anomaly readings and equipment malfunctions, but lacked the quality to convince skeptics. His reconstructed sketches of the archive symbols, drawn from memory during decompression stops and photographed with the hidden camera Rees had preserved, provided documentation of the notation system even though Griffin had no way to prove their origin or authenticate their connection to the actual dive site. The dive computer's internal memory, which Griffin had backed up to encrypted cloud storage before surrendering the physical device, contained time-stamped records of depth, temperature, and gas mixture data that showed the impossible thermal readings and could be verified against known diving physics. And the microscopic fragment, the piece so small it had escaped detection during the equipment confiscation, remained in Griffin's possession, secured in a safe deposit box along with the laboratory analysis report that described isotopic ratios inconsistent with terrestrial geology and manufacturing precision that exceeded human technological capabilities by factors that materials scientists found difficult to quantify without sounding like they were endorsing conspiracy theories or abandoning. Scientific credibility. Local fishermen working waters near the exclusion zone, men who'd spent decades navigating those seas and understood current patterns and seasonal variations in ways that no amount of formal oceanographic training could replicate. Reported phenomena that corroborated aspects of Griffin's experience while adding new dimensions of strangeness to the situation. Multiple fishing crews described seeing lights beneath the surface at night, not the familiar blue-green bioluminescence of plankton or the directed beams of submarine research vehicles, but diffuse amber illumination that seemed to emanate from the seafloor itself and pulse in regular patterns that one captain described as resembling Morse code, though no one could identify what message the lights might be transmitting. Hydrophone recordings from academic research projects monitoring whale populations and seismic activity in the region had captured low-frequency sound emanating from the area around Griffin's dive site, vibrations at wavelengths that propagated efficiently through water and rock, but remained largely inaudible to human ears without specialized equipment. Sounds that occurred in regular intervals, suggesting artificial generation rather than natural geological processes. When Griffin contacted the researcher who'd published the hydrophone data, a marine biologist at the University of Athens named Dr. Isaac Thorne, the conversation had been brief and uncomfortable, with Thorne confirming the acoustic recordings existed but declining to speculate about their origin, and mentioning that his research permit for the area had been revoked shortly after he'd submitted preliminary findings to his institution, with no explanation beyond vague references to security. Considerations that made no sense for a whale communication study. The official classification of the site and the surrounding waters remained unchanged as of October 2024, 18 months after Griffin's discovery, with NATO and Hellenic government authorities maintaining that the exclusion zone protected significant archaeological heritage, requiring careful study before any public disclosure of findings, language that sounded reasonable but had been used for longer than most archaeological surveys typically required to produce at least. Preliminary results and publications. No peer-reviewed papers had emerged from the supposedly ongoing research operations. No academic conferences had featured presentations about the significant discoveries that would justify excluding an area of international waters for over a year. The silence from official channels was comprehensive and telling, suggesting that whatever was being studied at the site had produced findings that authorities considered too sensitive or too paradigm-challenging to release through normal scientific communication channels. Griffin had located leaked NATO documents dated as recently as March 2024, partially redacted memoranda discussing expanded survey operations, and additional archive locations identified through pattern analysis, language that implied the 14 Mediterranean structures Holden had documented were not the complete network, that more installations existed in other ocean basins, or at depths that previous survey efforts hadn't reached, and that a systematic search was underway to map the full extent of whatever monitoring system had been recording human civilization for 12,000 years. Griffin's life had stabilized into a new abnormal equilibrium by the fall of 2024, a balance between maintaining surface appearances of normalcy while privately pursuing investigation into questions that most people would consider either fantasy or paranoia. He worked remotely from a home office, taking the anonymous consulting contracts that paid well and asked few questions, providing technical analysis to clients he never met for purposes he could only guess at. His family had relocated from suburban Boston to a smaller community in New Hampshire, officially for better schools and more outdoor space for the girls, but really to establish distance from the surveillance that had become part of their lives, the occasional unfamiliar vehicles parked near their previous house, the too frequent wrong number calls, the sense that privacy had become provisional and conditional. Claire had accepted the situation with pragmatic grace that came from 15 years of marriage to someone whose work involved calculated risks, though Griffin knew the stress affected her in ways she worked to conceal, and his daughters were old enough now to sense that something had changed in their family's circumstances, even if they didn't understand the specifics. He still experienced the cognitive enhancements that had emerged after his exposure to the archive, still found himself reading technical literature in fields outside his training, and comprehending concepts that should have required years of study, still had dreams that felt less like random neural processing and more like structured information transfer from sources he couldn't identify. And he'd learned to live with the unsettling possibility that something was accessing his mind while he slept, reviewing his memories and experiences for purposes he couldn't determine or prevent. The question of what happened next, of whether humanity would eventually face contact or confrontation, or simply continued observation by whoever or whatever operated the archive network, remained unanswered and perhaps unanswerable with the limited information available to individuals like Griffin who existed outside classified research programs. The structures were real, that much was certain, verified by multiple independent discoveries across decades and geographic locations. They were active, continuously processing and recording information through means that remained poorly understood even after 50 years of study by some of the most sophisticated research institutions on the planet. They formed patterns, geometric networks suggesting intentional positioning and coordinated operation across global scales. They affected people who encountered them, producing cognitive changes and apparent information transfer that persisted long after physical exposure ended. And they appeared to be preparing for something, transmitting data to unknown destinations, updating their archives with contemporary information, maintaining operational readiness for purposes that leaked documents hinted at but never fully explained. Whether those purposes were benign observation, scientific study, preparation for eventual diplomatic contact, or something less comfortable to contemplate, Griffin didn't know, but the evidence suggested that after 12,000 years of recording human development from stone tools to space exploration, from tribal villages to global civilization, the operators of the archive network might soon decide they'd gathered sufficient data to make whatever decision they'd been deferring while humanity matured or failed to mature into whatever criteria they used to judge intelligent species. The message arrived in Griffin's encrypted email 3 weeks ago, in late September of 2024, sender unknown. Routed through anonymizing networks that Holden confirmed were sophisticated enough to suggest either intelligence community tradecraft or access to similar resources. The message was brief, just 2 sentences that raised more questions than they answered, but conveyed meaning that Griffin found both exciting and terrifying. The plates aren't for us to learn about them. They're for them to learn about us, and they're almost ready for contact. No signature, no context, no way to verify whether the sender was a government insider, another diver who'd encountered the archives, or something far stranger that Griffin didn't want to seriously consider. He'd shown the message to Claire, to Holden, to Marcel, and none of them could offer interpretation beyond the obvious implications, that 12,000 years of observation might be approaching completion, that whoever had built and maintained the archive network had accumulated enough data to make decisions about humanity's future, and that contact of some form might be imminent on timescales that could mean years or decades, but probably not centuries. Griffin had saved the message, backed it up in multiple secure locations, and found himself checking his email compulsively for follow-up communication that never came, wondering if he should feel hope or fear about the prospect of humanity finally learning who'd been watching and recording and judging them since before the pyramids were built, since before writing was invented, since before agriculture transformed nomadic tribes into civilizations that would eventually develop the technology, to discover they'd been monitored all along. The most recent leaked footage, ROV video from August of 2024, that Holden obtained through sources he wouldn't identify beyond sympathetic personnel in research operations, showed Griffin's dive site with one critical difference from the structure he'd documented in April of 2023. The 15-foot circular portal that had led into the chamber with the suspended data plates was no longer sealed by whatever mechanism had kept the interior space isolated and pressurized and impossibly warm. The opening stood vacant in the ROV's floodlights, passive sonar showing the chamber beyond empty of the metallic plates that had filled the space during Griffin's exploration, as if the archive had completed its data collection from that location and withdrawn its recording systems to somewhere else, or perhaps uploaded their contents to whatever destination those low-frequency transmissions had been targeting. Whether something had left through that open portal, or something had entered, or the archive simply no longer needed to maintain active presence at a location that had already been discovered and documented and compromised by human awareness, the footage didn't reveal. But the opening remained, dark and vacant and somehow expectant, waiting for someone or something to either emerge from the depths or descend into whatever lay beyond that threshold. And Griffin found himself wondering if he'd been the first human to access the archive or merely the most recent in a long succession of individuals across 12,000 years who'd been allowed to discover what was being recorded about their species, and whether that discovery was part of the test, part of the evaluation, part of the process by which humanity's readiness for contact would ultimately be judged.